The stars around Nexara Prime burned with unnatural fire as the Vorthak fleet moved through space like hungry predators. Their ships looked wrong somehow, as if metal and flesh had been twisted together by some mad god. Dark, organic curves merged, with gleaming armor plates, while pulsing veins of bioenergy ran along their hulls like alien blood vessels. These were not just machines of war, but living things that fed on conquest and grew stronger with each victory. High Commander Thexmore stood on the bridge of his flagship World Render and watched the crystalline cities of Nexara Prime sparkle below. The Nexarans had built their civilization to be beautiful, with towers that caught starlight and reflected it in rainbow patterns across their world. It would all be ash soon enough. Thexmore felt the ship's neural network pulse with anticipation as it analyzed the enemy defenses. The biomechanical systems were already learning, already adapting to what they saw. The Nexaran fleet rose to meet them with grace and precision. Their ships moved like dancers, weaving between the Vorthak vessels while firing beams of concentrated stellar energy. For a moment, it seemed they might actually pose a challenge, their weapons carved through space with deadly accuracy, and their formations flowed like water around the Vorthak advance. But Thexmore had seen this dance before on 17 other worlds. He watched as his ships began to change. The neural networks processed each Nexaran attack pattern and fed the data to the biomechanical systems. Hull plating shifted and reformed to better deflect the energy beams. Weapon arrays rotated and reconfigured themselves to match the Nexaran firing angles. Within minutes, his fleet was no longer the same as when the battle began. It was evolving. The Nexaran Admiral Veltara commanded her forces with desperate skill. She had studied the reports from other fallen worlds and knew what her people faced. The Vorthak did not just conquer, they learned. Every tactic used against them became useless within hours as their ships adapted and overcame. But she had to try. Her world depended on it. Her flagship Corona's Light led a brilliant maneuver that brought half the Nexaran fleet around the Vorthak flank, while the other half pressed the center. For 30 minutes, it worked perfectly. The Vorthak ships found themselves caught between two fires and took heavy damage. Several of their bioships leaked strange fluids into space as their living hulls were breached. But then the adaptation kicked in. The Vorthak neural networks finally understood the Nexaran battle doctrine. Their ships began moving in new patterns that countered every Nexaran advantage. Weapons that had been effective moments before now missed their targets, as the enemy hulls shifted just enough to deflect them. Formation attacks that should have worked were anticipated and countered before they could be completed. Thexmore smiled as he felt his ship's satisfaction through the neural link. The World Render was no longer just learning about Nexaran tactics. It was learning about Nexaran psychology. The biomechanical systems could predict not just what the enemy would do, but what they were thinking of doing. Admiral Veltara's next 3 maneuvers were countered before she even gave the orders. The battle turned into a slaughter. One by one, the beautiful Nexaran ships were destroyed or disabled. Their energy beams became useless as the Vorthak hulls adapted to absorb and redirect them. Their graceful formations became death traps as the enemy learned to predict and exploit every movement. Admiral Veltara watched her fleet die around her and knew that her world was lost. Far across the galaxy in the Outer Rim territories, Captain Dongmin sat in his command chair aboard the human battleship Indomitable and listened to the death screams of another civilization. The transmission was weak and broken, but the message was clear. The Nexarans were trying to warn anyone who would listen about the enemy that was coming for them all. Dongmin was older than most starship captains, with gray threading through his black hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many battles. He had commanded the Indomitable for 15 years and fought in dozens of conflicts across human space. But he had never heard anything like the desperation in these alien voices. His tactical officer Hyejin worked at her station with quiet intensity. She was young for her rank, but had proven herself in the border wars against the Keltharan pirates. Her fingers danced over the control panels as she tried to extract more information from the fragmentary signals. What she found made her face go pale. "Captain," she said without looking up from her displays, "the tactical data is impossible. No fleet should be able to adapt this quickly to enemy fire. According to these readings, the Vorthak ships were changing their defensive configurations in real time during combat." Dongmin nodded slowly. He had been studying the reports for weeks as world after world fell to this new threat. The pattern was always the same. A powerful alien civilization would meet the Vorthak fleet with confidence and advanced weapons. They would fight bravely and skillfully. They would even score early victories. Then something would change. The Vorthak would learn. The Vorthak would adapt. The Vorthak would win. "Sir," called out Lieutenant Junho from the communications station, "I'm picking up more transmissions. The Nexaran government is broadcasting on all frequencies. They're saying their homeworld has fallen." The bridge fell silent except for the soft hum of the ship's systems. Another civilization had died. Another piece of the galaxy had been consumed by an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Dongmin could see the fear in his crew's eyes. They were all thinking the same thing. How long before the Vorthak came for humanity? On Nexara Prime, the last pockets of resistance were being eliminated. The crystalline towers that had once caught starlight now lay in ruins. Thexmore walked through the rubble of what had been their capital city and marveled at how predictable it all was. The Nexarans had fought with skill and courage, but they had followed patterns that his neural networks could analyze and counter. Every species thought they were unique. Every species believed their technology or tactics would be the key to victory. They never understood that the Vorthak had seen it all before. Energy weapons, kinetic projectiles, quantum disruptors, dimensional phasing, psionic attacks. All of it had been tried and all of it had failed. His ships learned from every encounter and grew stronger. The biomechanical systems were already processing the data from this battle and incorporating the successful Nexaran technologies into their own designs. Soon the Vorthak fleet would have energy weapons as advanced as anything the crystalline people had created. But they would also have everything they had learned from the 16 other civilizations they had conquered. Thexmore looked up at the stars and selected his next target. The Keltharan Republic lay 3 systems away. They were known throughout the galaxy as master tacticians with weapons that could strike from other dimensions. It would be interesting to see how quickly his ships could adapt to that particular challenge. Back aboard the Indomitable, Captain Dongmin made a decision that would change everything. Instead of retreating deeper into human space or joining with other species to form a defensive alliance, he ordered his ship to alter course toward the Vorthak advance. His crew looked at him with confusion, but they trusted their captain enough to follow his orders without question. "Sir," Hyejin asked quietly, "what are we going to do against an enemy that can adapt to any tactic we use?" Dongmin smiled for the first time in weeks. "We're going to do something they won't expect," he said. "We're going to do something that can't be predicted or countered because it doesn't follow any logical pattern at all." The Indomitable turned toward the advancing darkness, while across the galaxy the Vorthak fleet prepared for their next easy conquest. Neither side knew that this war was about to change in ways no one could have imagined. The Keltharan Republic had been preparing for war since the first reports of Vorthak conquest reached their home system. Their red-skinned warriors were among the most feared fighters in the galaxy, not for their strength or numbers, but for their brilliant tactical minds. Every Keltharan child learned battle strategy before they learned to walk, and their greatest generals could plan campaigns that spanned decades. Admiral Minji of the Human Diplomatic Corps had traveled to the Keltharan homeworld hoping to coordinate a joint defense. She stood in the massive war room of their high command and watched as hundreds of Keltharan officers moved pieces around holographic battle displays. Their planning was impressive, but she could see they were making the same mistake every other species had made. "You're thinking like the Vorthak expect you to think," she told General Vextar, the Keltharan Supreme Commander. "They've conquered 17 civilizations because they can predict logical military responses. You need to try something different." Vexatar was a massive Keltharan with scars covering his red skin and tactical implants glowing along his skull. He looked at the small human woman with barely concealed contempt. "We have studied every battle the Vorthak have fought," he growled. "We know their weaknesses. Our weapons can strike from dimensions they cannot even detect. Our ships can phase in and out of normal space faster than their sensors can track. They will learn nothing from us because they will never see us coming." Minji tried to explain what she had learned from studying the Nexaran defeat, but the Keltharans were too proud to listen. They had never lost a major battle in their 1,000-year history, and they could not believe that any enemy could overcome their tactical superiority. She left their homeworld knowing that another species was about to discover how dangerous overconfidence could be. 3 weeks later, the Vorthak fleet arrived at the edge of Keltheran space. High Commander Thexmore stood on his bridge and studied the enemy formations with interest. The Keltherans had positioned their ships in defensive patterns that made no immediate sense. There were gaps in their lines that seemed to invite attack and weak points that were obviously bait for some kind of trap. "Interesting," he murmured, as the neural networks began their analysis. The biomechanical systems were already cataloging Keltheran ship designs and weapon signatures. These would be more challenging opponents than the Nexarans, but the result would be the same. It always was. The battle began at dawn on the third day with a Keltheran attack that defied every known law of space combat. Their ships simply vanished from normal space-time and reappeared inside the Vorthak formations, firing quantum disruption weapons that tore through armor and hull like paper. Before the Vorthak could respond, half their forward line was destroyed, or crippled. Thexmore felt genuine surprise through his neural link. The Keltherans were not just using dimensional phasing technology, they were using it in ways that should have been impossible. Their ships were existing in multiple dimensions, simultaneously striking from angles that had no physical meaning. It was brilliant and terrifying. The second wave of Keltheran attacks came from 17 different dimensional phases at once. Vorthak ships found themselves under fire from enemies they could not see or target. The biomechanical systems struggled to adapt to weapons that existed partially outside normal reality. For the first time since the conquest began, Thexmore watched his ships take serious casualties. General Vextar commanded the battle from his flagship Pride of Kelthar and felt the intoxication of victory flowing through his veins. The Vorthak were powerful, but they were also predictable. They relied too heavily on their adaptation abilities and not enough on pure tactical genius. He had spent months planning this battle, and every move was unfolding exactly as he had foreseen. "Phase the Third Fleet to coordinates 77 Alpha, he ordered. "Hit their command ships while they're still trying to understand our first attack pattern." But even as his orders went out, Vextar noticed something troubling. The Vorthak ships were beginning to change. Their hulls were developing new sensor arrays that seemed designed to detect dimensional shifts. Their weapons were rotating to fire into empty space where his ships would materialize seconds later. They were learning. By the second day of battle, the Vorthak adaptation was becoming obvious. Ships that had been completely unable to track dimensional phase shifts were now predicting them with increasing accuracy. Biomechanical systems that had been designed for normal space combat were evolving new capabilities in real time. The Keltheran advantage was disappearing with each passing hour. "Impossible," Vextar muttered as he watched another of his phase attacks get intercepted before it could strike its target. They cannot adapt this quickly to technology they have never encountered before. But they could, and they were. The neural networks were not just learning about Keltheran weapons and tactics, they were learning about the mathematical principles behind dimensional phasing itself. Within hours, the Vorthak ships were not just defending against phase attacks, they were beginning to use similar techniques in their own assault patterns. Far away in human space, Captain Dong Min sat in his ready room aboard the Indomitable and watched the battle reports with growing understanding. Lieutenant Junho had managed to tap into Keltheran military communications, and the intelligence they were gathering was both fascinating and terrifying. The Vorthak ships are literally rewriting their own design specifications during combat, reported Hyejin as she analyzed the tactical data. Their hulls are growing new sensor organs and weapon systems that didn't exist when the battle started. It's like they're evolving in fast forward. Dongmin nodded grimly. He had suspected something like this from the earlier battle reports, but seeing it happen in real time was still shocking. The Vorthak were not just using advanced technology, they were using technology that could improve itself by fighting other advanced technology. Every species that faced them was essentially teaching them how to become even more dangerous. "Sir," called Junho from his station, "I'm detecting something else in the Keltheran transmissions. Their commanders are starting to panic. The phase attacks that worked perfectly yesterday are being countered today. Some of their ships are being destroyed by weapons that use their own dimensional technology against them." The battle raged for another day before General Vextar finally understood. the full scope of what he was facing. The Vorthak were not just adapting to Keltharan tactics, they were improving on them. Biomechanical systems that had never existed in any dimension were now phasing through space-time with more skill than warriors who had trained for centuries to master the technique. His flagship shuddered as Vorthak weapons fired from 7 different dimensional phases simultaneously. The pride of Kelthar's shields collapsed under an assault pattern that used his own people's most advanced technology against them. Vextar felt the bitter taste of defeat as he realized his tactical genius meant nothing against an enemy that could learn and surpass any strategy he devised. All ships retreat to fallback positions, he ordered, though he knew it was already too late. The Vorthak had learned everything they needed to know about dimensional warfare, and now they were using that knowledge to hunt down the fleeing Keltharan fleet. Ships that tried to phase into hidden dimensions found Vorthak weapons waiting for them. Escape routes that should have been secret were suddenly blocked by enemies that had never used dimensional technology before this battle. The Keltharan defeat was even more complete than the Nexaran disaster. Not only were their ships destroyed, but their most advanced military secrets were stolen and improved upon by the enemy. Within hours, the Vorthak fleet had weapons and capabilities that made them more dangerous than ever before. High Commander Thexmore walked through the ruins of the Keltharan capital and felt the satisfaction of another successful conquest. The biomechanical systems were already integrating dimensional phasing technology into the fleet's standard equipment. Soon, every Vorthak ship would be able to strike from multiple dimensions simultaneously while remaining completely undetectable to conventional sensors. But even as he savored this victory, Thexmore was puzzled by something he had detected during the battle. Human ships had been observing from long range, recording everything that happened. Most species would have fled or tried to form an alliance after watching such demonstrations of Vorthak power. Instead, the humans seemed to be studying his fleet with scientific curiosity. Interesting, he murmured as he looked up at the stars. Perhaps the humans would provide more of a challenge than these other species. Their technology was primitive compared to the Keltharans or Nexarans, but they had survived longer than most in this dangerous galaxy. It would be educational to see what they had learned about warfare. Aboard the Indomitable, Captain Dong Min finished reviewing the battle recordings and made his final preparations. The Vorthak fleet would reach human space within weeks, and when they arrived, they would find something waiting for them that no neural network could analyze or predict. They had adapted to energy weapons and kinetic projectiles and dimensional phasing technology. But they had never tried to adapt to pure human chaos. Set course for the Sol System perimeter, he ordered. The edge of the Sol System had never seemed so empty or so vast. Captain Dong Min stood on the bridge of the Indomitable and watched the stars through the main viewport, knowing that somewhere in that darkness the most dangerous enemy humanity had ever faced was approaching. His ship hung motionless in the void like a steel monument to human stubbornness, alone against an entire fleet of adaptive biomechanical predators. The crew had been preparing for 3 weeks, but their preparations were unlike anything in military history. Instead of drilling standard combat maneuvers, they had been practicing complete randomness. Instead of memorizing tactical protocols, they had been learning to ignore every instinct that made sense. It went against everything they had been taught about warfare, but Dongmin knew it was their only chance. Hyejin worked at her tactical station with intense concentration. The young officer had initially struggled with the concept of abandoning all logical strategy, but now she understood what they were trying to achieve. Her screen showed not battle plans or targeting solutions, but random number generators and chaos algorithms. She had turned her station into a machine for creating beautiful unpredictability. "Contact at long range," reported Lieutenant Junho from communications. "Multiple ships approaching from the outer system. Biomechanical signatures match Vorthak fleet composition. The enemy had arrived." High Commander Thexmore led his fleet into the Sol system with confidence built on 17 consecutive victories. His neural networks had already analyzed human military doctrine from encounters with other species, and the data showed nothing remarkable. Humans favored direct assault tactics with primitive kinetic weapons and basic energy shields. They were known for being stubborn in defense, but their technology was centuries behind the most advanced civilizations the Vorthak had conquered. "Interesting," Thexmore murmured, as his sensors detected the single human ship waiting for them. The Indomitable was large for a human vessel, but tiny compared to his flagship world render. Its design was crude and functional, with none of the elegant curves of Nexaran ships or the dimensional complexity of Keltharan vessels. It looked like exactly what he expected from a primitive species that still used chemical propulsion and metal armor. But there was something puzzling about the human ship's behavior. It was not moving to attack or attempting to flee. It was not broadcasting surrender demands or trying to negotiate. It was not even scanning his fleet with active sensors. It was simply sitting there in space doing absolutely nothing. The biomechanical systems began their standard analysis protocols but found very little to work with. The human ship showed no tactical formations because it was alone. It demonstrated no advanced weapons because all systems were powered down. It revealed no strategic intentions because it was not moving or communicating. For the first time in the conquest, the neural networks had nothing to adapt to. Hours passed in this strange standoff. Thexmore's fleet spread into their standard, adaptive formation, and waited for the humans to make some kind of move that would reveal their strategy. The biomechanical systems ran constant scans looking for hidden weapons or cloaked reinforcements or some explanation for why a single primitive ship would dare to face an entire Vorthak fleet. Aboard the Indomitable, the crew waited with nervous excitement. Engineer So-young had spent days modifying their systems in ways that would have horrified any normal military inspector. Weapons targeting computers had been replaced with random selection programs. Navigation systems had been rewired to follow probability curves instead of tactical requirements. Even the ship's coffee maker had been connected to the fire control network for reasons that made sense to no one except her. "Sir," Hyejin said quietly, "they've been studying us for 6 hours and haven't moved to attack. I think we're confusing them." Dongmin smiled. Confusion was exactly what he wanted. The Vorthak had conquered the galaxy by learning to predict and counter their enemies. If those enemies did things that could not be predicted, then the whole system would break down. But first they had to start the process of breaking it. "All stations prepare for random engagement," he announced. "Remember, nothing we do should make tactical sense. If you think of a logical reason for any action, don't do it. Trust your instincts to be completely wrong." He paused for a moment and looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. These were good people who had trained their entire careers to be professional soldiers. Now he was asking them to throw away everything they had learned and fight, like madmen. But they trusted him enough to try. "Commence attack," he ordered. What happened next would have driven any military academy instructor to despair. The Indomitable suddenly burst into motion, but not toward any target that made sense. Instead of charging the enemy fleet or attempting to outflank them, it began flying in a complex spiral pattern that seemed designed by a drunk mathematician. Its weapons came online and immediately started firing, but not at the Vorthak ships. Weapons. Specialist Tai Hyun followed his random targeting program with religious devotion. Missiles launched toward empty space, while laser batteries fired at asteroids millions of kilometers away. Plasma cannons charged up and then discharged their energy into the void without hitting anything at all. To any observer, it looked like the human ship had suffered a complete systems failure and was firing wildly in all directions. The Vorthak neural network struggled to analyze this behavior. Every military action was supposed to have some purpose, even if that purpose was not immediately obvious. Diversionary tactics, probing attacks, psychological warfare, desperate attempts to damage something before being destroyed. All of these were predictable responses that could be countered. But the humans were not trying to accomplish anything at all. "Fascinating," Thexmore said as he watched the human ship continue its bizarre performance. "Their weapons are functioning normally, but they are targeting random coordinates with no tactical value. Either their crew has lost their minds, or this is some kind of strategy I have never encountered." The biomechanical systems began trying to find patterns in the chaos. Perhaps the random firing was actually a complex code meant to summon reinforcements. Perhaps the spiral flight path was designed to confuse sensors while the ship moved toward some hidden objective. Perhaps the humans were trying to lure the Vorthak fleet into some kind of trap. But hours of analysis revealed no hidden meaning. The humans were simply acting without any logical purpose. Their ship would suddenly accelerate in one direction, then immediately reverse course for no apparent reason. Their weapons would focus on one area of space, then switched to completely different targets without warning. Their communications array broadcast everything from classical music to mathematical equations to what sounded like cooking recipes. Lieutenant Junho was having the time of his life at the communications station. His random broadcasting program was sending out everything in the ship's computer databases in completely random order. One moment he was transmitting human poetry to the Vorthak fleet, the next he was sending technical specifications for bathroom plumbing. The alien ships were probably getting more confused with every message. The Vorthak fleet began to show signs of strain. Ships that were designed to adapt to enemy tactics found themselves trying to counter strategies that did not exist. Neural networks that had successfully analyzed 17 different alien civilizations were overwhelmed by an enemy that refused to follow any pattern they could understand. Some of the biomechanical systems began developing what could only be described as electronic headaches. They were programmed to find solutions to tactical problems, but the humans were not presenting any problems to solve. Instead, they were creating a constant stream of meaningless data that served no purpose except to be completely unpredictable. "Sir," Hijin reported with barely controlled laughter, "I'm reading system malfunctions throughout the enemy fleet. Their ships are trying to adapt to our tactics, but our tactics keep changing every few seconds. Some of their vessels appear to be stuck in recursive analysis loops." The battle became a surreal dance of madness versus machine logic. The Indomitable continued its chaotic performance, while the Vorthak fleet struggled to respond to an enemy. That made no sense. Biomechanical systems that had conquered the galaxy found themselves helpless against pure human randomness. Soyoung monitored her bizarre modifications from the engineering deck and watched with satisfaction as every system performed exactly as randomly as she had designed. The ship's artificial gravity fluctuated according to the rhythm of an ancient folk song, while the environmental controls followed weather patterns from a planet nobody had ever visited. Even the ship's waste recycling system had been programmed to operate according to the principles of abstract art. For the first time in their conquest, the Vorthak faced an enemy they could not understand or predict. The humans had discovered their greatest weakness. The very adaptation that made them unstoppable also made them vulnerable to pure chaos. As ship after ship in the alien fleet began to malfunction, High Commander Thexmore realized he might have finally met an opponent he could not defeat. The battle had become something beyond the understanding of any military textbook ever written. The Indomitable danced through space like a ship possessed by the spirit of madness itself, while the Vorthak fleet struggled to comprehend an enemy that defied every law of logical warfare. What had started as a simple conquest was turning into a nightmare of confusion and system failures. Weapons specialist Tae-hyun had abandoned all pretense of normal military procedure and was now firing according to a program based on his grandmother's method for predicting weather. When the atmospheric pressure readings from his homeworld were high, he targeted the left side of the enemy formation. When they were low, he fired at random coordinates between the Vorthak ships. When it was cloudy on a planet 300 light-years away, he switched to plasma weapons. The system made no sense to anyone, including himself, but it was working perfectly. The Vorthak neural networks were approaching something that could only be described as a mechanical nervous breakdown. Every time they thought they had detected a pattern in human behavior, the pattern would suddenly change to something completely different. Targeting algorithms designed to predict enemy movements found themselves trying to calculate the flight path of weapons that were aimed at empty space. Tactical analysis programs crashed repeatedly as they attempted to understand strategies that had no purpose. High Commander Thexmore felt something he had not experienced in centuries of conquest: genuine uncertainty. His biomechanical systems were sending him contradictory reports that made no logical sense. Some ships reported that the humans were using advanced psychological warfare techniques. Others insisted that the enemy had suffered a complete mental breakdown. A few were convinced that this was all an elaborate trap designed to lure the Vorthak fleet into some unknown danger. "Status report," he demanded from his tactical officer. "Sir, the neural networks are unable to provide coherent analysis. The human ship continues to demonstrate behavior that serves no tactical purpose. Our adaptation protocols are failing because there is nothing logical to adapt to. Several of our vessels are experiencing cascade failures in their biomechanical systems." Thexmore stared at the display showing the lone human ship continuing its insane dance through space. It was still firing weapons at random targets and broadcasting incomprehensible messages while flying in patterns that hurt to look at. Worse, his own fleet was beginning to suffer real damage as their sophisticated systems tried and failed to process the chaos. Aboard the Indomitable, Engineer So-young was monitoring the effects of their unconventional warfare with scientific fascination. The modifications she had made to their ship's systems were working better than she had dared to hope. Every component was operating according to different rules of randomness, and the combined effect was pure, beautiful chaos. "Captain," she reported over the intercom, "I'm reading massive system strain throughout the enemy fleet. Their biomechanical components appear to be overheating from trying to process our behavior patterns. 3 of their ships have gone completely dead in space." Dongmin nodded with satisfaction. The plan was working, but they were also taking damage. The Vorthak might be confused, but they still had overwhelming firepower, and some of their shots were hitting the Indomitable through pure chance. Hull breaches were appearing faster than the repair teams could seal them, and several key systems were operating at reduced efficiency. "Sir," Hyejin called out from her tactical station, "enemy ships are beginning to target us with area effect weapons. I think they've given up trying to predict our movements and are just firing at the general area where we might be." That was actually encouraging news. It meant the Vorthak had abandoned their sophisticated targeting systems and were reduced to crude spray-and-pray tactics. But it also meant the Indomitable was about to face a massive barrage of weapons fire designed to destroy everything in a large volume of space. "Evasive maneuvers," Dongmin ordered. "Pattern So-young 7. Pattern So-young 7 was based on the migration patterns of butterflies mixed with mathematical principles from chaos theory. The ship began moving in a series of seemingly random curves and spirals that had no logical relationship to each other. To make it even more confusing, Lieutenant Junho began broadcasting the ship's position using false coordinates that placed them in 17 different locations simultaneously. The Vorthak area effect weapons filled space with destructive energy. But somehow the Indomitable managed to avoid most of the damage by being exactly where no logical analysis would predict. The few hits they took were absorbed by armor plating that So-young had modified to be randomly thick in some areas and randomly thin in others. The ship's shield systems operated according to the feeding schedule of extinct animals and proved surprisingly effective at deflecting weapons that were designed to penetrate logically configured defenses. But the strain was beginning to show. Half the Vorthak fleet might be suffering from neural cascade failures, but the other half was still functional and extremely dangerous. The Indomitable was taking hits and accumulating damage faster than their repair systems could handle. Dongmin knew they needed to escalate their chaos tactics before the enemy managed to destroy them through sheer firepower. "All hands prepare for close engagement," he announced. "We're going to get personal with these biomechanical nightmares." What happened next would have been considered insane by any military commander in the galaxy. Instead of maintaining a safe distance from the overwhelmingly superior enemy fleet, the Indomitable charged directly into the middle of the Vorthak formation. But it did not charge in a straight line, or at maximum speed, or with weapons blazing. Instead, it meandered through the enemy ships like a tourist taking a leisurely stroll through a dangerous neighborhood. Tae-hyun fired weapons at targets selected by spinning a virtual wheel that contained the names of every crew member's pets. When the wheel landed on Fluffy, he targeted the nearest Vorthak ship. When it selected Mr. Whiskers, he fired at whatever was directly behind them. The targeting system also took into account the current price of coffee on the galactic commodity, exchange, and the number of times the word banana had been spoken on the ship that day. The close-range battle became even more surreal than the long-distance engagement. Vorthak ships found themselves trying to target an enemy that was flying between them in patterns that defied three-dimensional geometry. The Indomitable would suddenly appear next to a biomechanical cruiser, fire a spread of missiles at a completely different target, broadcast a recipe for mushroom soup, and then accelerate away in a direction that pointed toward nothing in particular. Some of the Vorthak neural networks finally gave up completely. The biomechanical systems that had successfully conquered 17 civilizations simply shut down rather than continue trying to process behavior that violated every principle of logical thought. Entire ships went dark as their adaptive intelligence decided that this level of chaos was beyond their ability to understand or counter. High Commander Thexmore watched his perfect fleet falling apart and felt something that might have been panic if his species was capable of that emotion. His neural, linked to the ship's systems, was filled with error messages and contradiction warnings. The biomechanical networks were reporting that the humans were simultaneously using advanced tactics that surpassed anything they had seen before and primitive tactics that made no sense at all. "Sir," his tactical officer reported with obvious strain, "to recommend we withdraw to a safe distance and reassess the situation. Our adaptation protocols are not designed to handle this level of unpredictability." For a moment, Thexmore considered the suggestion. His fleet was more powerful than this single human ship, but power meant nothing if it could not be applied effectively. The biomechanical systems needed logical patterns to adapt to, and the humans were providing nothing but beautiful chaos. But retreating from a single primitive ship would be unthinkable. The Vorthak Dominion had never withdrawn from any battle, and Thexmore would not be the first commander to break that tradition. There had to be some way to counter this human insanity. "Prepare boarding shuttles," he ordered. "If we cannot defeat their ship, we will take their crew. Once we eliminate the source of this chaos, our systems should be able to reset and function normally." It was a desperate plan, but it might work. The humans could make their ship behave randomly, but they were still biological creatures operating in a physical environment. Once Vorthak soldiers were aboard their vessel, the chaos would have to stop, and normal combat would resume. As boarding shuttles launched from the Vorthak fleet toward the Indomitable, Dongmin smiled grimly. The enemy was finally being forced to abandon their greatest advantage and fight on human terms. What they did not realize was that humans had been perfecting the art of chaos for thousands of years, and they were very good at it. The boarding shuttles approached the Indomitable like predatory insects seeking their prey. High Commander Thexmore led the assault personally, believing that only by eliminating the human crew could he restore order to this chaotic battle. His biomechanical armor was configured for close combat, and his weapons were designed to adapt to any personal defense system the humans might use. He had no doubt that once aboard their ship, normal military logic would prevail. Captain Dongmin watched the approaching shuttles on his tactical display and felt a cold satisfaction. The Vorthak were about to discover that human chaos was not limited to space combat. He activated the ship's internal communication system and addressed his crew with the calm voice of a man who had planned for exactly this moment. "All hands, prepare for boarding action. Remember everything we practiced. Nothing we do should make sense to an enemy that thinks logically. Trust your training to be completely wrong and your instincts to be beautifully chaotic." Engineer Soyoung had spent the last 3 weeks turning the Indomitable into a maze of controlled insanity. Corridors that should lead to the bridge instead opened onto storage closets. Emergency lighting systems had been rewired to flash in patterns based on ancient human poetry. Gravity plating had been modified so that some areas had normal gravity, while others had reduced gravity or gravity that pointed in random directions. The ship's internal layout now resembled something designed by an artist having a fever dream. The first Vorthak boarding party cut through the hull near the main cargo bay and immediately encountered something that violated every principle of logical ship design. Instead of finding a cargo bay, they found themselves in what appeared to be a forest. Soyoung had filled the space with artificial trees and holographic wildlife, while the environmental systems produced the sounds and smells of an alien jungle. The gravity pointed sideways, and there were 3 different sources of light coming from directions that made no geometric sense. "Report," Thexmore demanded over the communication link. "Sir, we have successfully breached the enemy vessel, but the internal configuration does not match any known ship design. We appear to be in some kind of recreational facility or possibly a malfunctioning holodeck." Before Thexmore could respond, the Vorthak soldiers found themselves under attack by what could only be described as weaponized randomness. Lieutenant Junyo had rigged speakers throughout the ship to broadcast sounds designed to confuse and disorient. The artificial jungle filled with the noise of ancient Earth animals mixed with contemporary human music and mathematical equations being read by children's voices. The Vorthak soldiers were trained to adapt to any combat environment, but they had never encountered an environment that changed its fundamental properties every few minutes. One moment, they were walking through a jungle. The next, they were in what appeared to be an underwater cave, and then suddenly they were floating in zero gravity while holographic butterflies flew around them, broadcasting stock market reports. Weapons. Specialist Tae-hyun had positioned himself in a maintenance shaft that connected to the cargo bay through a route that should not have existed according to the ship's original blueprints. He waited until the confused Vorthak soldiers were completely disoriented and then attacked using tactics he had learned from studying ancient human martial arts combined with zero-gravity combat techniques and principles borrowed from competitive cooking. The result was a fighting style that no military academy had ever taught, and no logical analysis could predict. Tae-hyun moved through the artificial environment like a dancer, performing to music only he could hear. He used maintenance, tools as weapons, and turned environmental systems into traps. When the Vorthak soldiers tried to adapt to his attacks, he would suddenly switch to completely different techniques based on the number of letters in his mother's maiden name. More boarding parties had breached the ship in other locations, but they all encountered similar chaos. One group found themselves in a corridor where the floor was actually the ceiling, and the walls were covered with mirrors that reflected things that were not there. Another group discovered a room where the artificial gravity changed direction every 30 seconds, according to the schedule of passenger trains on a planet in the Centauri system. Engineer So-young moved through her modified ship like a ghost. In a machine she had personally driven insane. She had spent years learning every system aboard the Indomitable, and now she used that knowledge to create traps that should not have been possible. Emergency blast doors opened and closed according to the phases of a moon that existed only in human mythology. Life support systems created pockets of atmosphere with different chemical compositions based on recipes for traditional foods from various human cultures. The Vorthak soldiers found themselves breathing air that smelled like cinnamon in one corridor, and vanilla in the next, while holographic projectors filled their vision with images that had no tactical significance. Their biomechanical armor tried to adapt to these conditions, but kept malfunctioning because there was nothing logical to adapt to. High Commander Thexmore led a strike team toward what his sensors indicated was the ship's bridge, but the route they followed seemed to exist in defiance of spatial geometry. Corridors connected to other corridors in ways that hurt to think about. Doorways led to rooms that were larger on the inside than they were on the outside. Stairways went up and down simultaneously while moving sideways through dimensions that had no names. When they finally reached what appeared to be the bridge, they found Captain Dong-min waiting for them with a smile that suggested he had been expecting this visit. The human commander was armed with nothing more threatening than a coffee cup and appeared completely relaxed despite being faced with heavily armed alien soldiers who had conquered most of the galaxy. "Welcome aboard the Indomitable," Dong-min said pleasantly. "I hope you enjoyed the tour. Would you like some coffee? It's made from beans that are grown in artificial gravity that changes direction every few minutes. The taste is completely unpredictable." Thexmore raised his weapon and prepared to end this madness by eliminating the source of human chaos. His biomechanical armor had finally adapted to the ship's bizarre environment, and his targeting systems were locked onto the human captain. But before he could fire, Dong-min did something that no military training had prepared him for. The human captain began dancing. It was not any recognizable form of combat or evasive maneuver. It was simply dancing, moving to music that existed only in his own mind while continuing to hold his coffee cup with perfect steadiness. The movements were graceful and completely pointless and absolutely impossible to predict or counter. Thexmore's targeting systems crashed as they tried to calculate attack vectors against an enemy who was not trying to attack or defend, but was simply moving for the pure joy of movement. His biomechanical armor attempted to adapt to this new form of combat, but there was nothing to adapt to because dancing was not combat at all. The final confrontation became a surreal duel between order and chaos, logic and intuition, adaptation, and pure human creativity. Thexmore attacked with weapons designed to counter any known fighting style, while Dong-min defended himself using techniques borrowed from ballet and martial arts and children's games. The human captain moved like water flowing around obstacles that did not exist, while the alien commander struggled to hit a target that refused to behave like a target. Lieutenant Junho appeared from a ventilation shaft and joined the fight using equipment he had borrowed from the ship's kitchen. Hyajin emerged from behind a control panel that should not have been large enough to hide anyone and began throwing objects that had no tactical value but somehow proved effective as weapons. Engineer So-young materialized from a doorway that had not existed moments before and attacked using tools designed for maintaining artificial gravity systems. The bridge became a chaos of random violence as the human crew fought with the passionate intensity of people defending their home against an enemy that could not be reasoned with or defeated through conventional means. They used every object in the room as a weapon and every surface as either cover or a launching point for impossible attacks. Thexmore found himself overwhelmed not by superior firepower or advanced tactics, but by pure human unpredictability. Every time he adapted to one form of attack, the humans would switch to something completely different. They fought with maintenance tools and coffee cups and pieces of equipment whose original purpose he could not even identify. The alien commander finally fell when So-young hit him with a device that was designed to calibrate artificial gravity systems, but which she was using as a club, while Dongmin distracted him by reciting poetry about flowers that grew on planets that had never existed. It was not a defeat that any military history would record as glorious or tactical or even comprehensible. As Thexmore collapsed, his biomechanical armor sparking and malfunctioning, he looked up at the human captain and asked the question that had been driving him insane since this battle began. Why? Why do you fight in ways that serve no purpose? Why do you use chaos instead of strategy? Why do you do things that make no sense? Dongmin knelt beside the fallen alien commander and offered him a sip of coffee from his somehow still intact cup.